Good afternoon, students. Today is Tuesday, 4 May 2021. This is the final lecture of the semester. We're going to wrap things up today. There will be no more lectures, and that means the only other item on our agenda will be the examination, which is 1 week from today. It's on the 11th of May. Now, just to remind you, on the 11th, which is a week from today, I will make available the examination from 8 in the morning until 8 in the evening. You have to go in during that 12-hour period and take the exam, which lasts for 75 minutes. It has the same format as the other two exams you took. Everything should be the same except, of course, the content. And if you want to know what the content is, go to the reading list for the course. It will show you the articles that we covered and that you will be tested on. So you're responsible not only for the readings, but for my lectures, everything I say in my lectures, and also for any handouts that I have posted along the way for you. Now, there are some handouts where I wrote optional reading. When I say that, that means it's optional. You don't have to read it. You may if you want, and I will not test you on any of the optional material. So let's get back to it. We're going to wrap things up. I'm going to begin today with the section entitled "The Newborn and the Fetus Are Morally Equivalent." This is a very important premise of the author's argument. They're arguing that if abortion in certain circumstances is acceptable, then so is infanticide, or what they call afterbirth abortion. And the reason is, in their view, that the moral status of the fetus is identical to or equivalent to the moral status of the infant or newborn. So this is a very important section of their article. So let's run through some of the similarities between a fetus and a newborn. First of all, both are human beings. Now, if you have my lecture notes printed, you can follow along. I'm at the top of page 5. Both the fetus inside the pregnant woman's body and the newborn, which is, of course, is outside of her body, both of them are human beings in the biological sense of the word human. Obviously, they're humans as opposed to dogs or chimpanzees or some other animal species. So they're both members of the same biological category, Homo sapiens sapiens. Okay? Secondly, both the fetus and the newborn are sentient, which means capable of feeling pain and pleasure, capable of suffering. Now, obviously, that's not true for a very early stage fetus, but at some point in the development of a fetus, it becomes sentient. It becomes capable of feeling pain or of suffering. And it has that in common with a newborn. So I guess we could say at least some fetuses have that in common with newborns, those who are sentient already. Third, both fetuses and newborns are potential persons. They have the potential to become persons. But, and here's the next item, according to the authors, neither a fetus nor a newborn is actually a person. They may be potential persons, but they're not actual persons. And the reason for that is they have not yet developed the capacities that make a being a person. What, in their view, is the capacity that makes one a person? Look at page 262. They put it this way: a person, quote, is capable of attributing to her own existence some, at least, basic value such that being deprived of this existence represents a loss to her or to him, unquote. Now, that's a little bit obscure. They don't go into much detail, but it seems as though in order for a being to be a person, in their view, that being has to have a certain amount of cognitive development. You have to be mature enough to understand certain things. You have to be mature enough to attribute certain value to your own existence. You have to be at least self-aware to some degree. Now, to the authors, there's a difference between being a human being in the biological sense and being a person in the moral sense or the psychological sense. And because these concepts differ, it's logically possible for a human being not to be a person. It's also logically for a person not to be a human being. And so for the authors, there are 4 categories. And in a moment, I'm going to go through the 4 categories and give you examples of each of them. Now, you may not agree with the authors, not everybody does, but we're trying to understand their position or where they're coming from. So, to go back to our point, we're going down a list of similarities between fetuses and newborns. And one of the similarities, according to the authors, is that neither one of them is a person. Neither one of them has the psychological, the set of capacities that are necessary to be a person. You and I have them, lots of people have them, lots of humans have them, but fetuses do not, and newborns, up until a certain point of their development, do not. All right, they go on to say that neither the fetus nor the newborn has a right to life. Their clumsy way of putting it is, neither is the subject of a moral right to life. And I think that's linked to the lack of personhood. Persons are the sorts of beings who have a right to life. So it's because fetuses and newborns lack personhood that they lack a moral right to life. So if you were to kill a fetus or a newborn, while it may be wrong for some reason, it's not a violation of the rights of those beings. Why? Because they don't have rights. They don't have a right to life in particular. Okay, a few more. Neither fetuses nor newborns, they say, is capable of, quote, making any aims, unquote. Maybe they meant to say making plans. You and I are mature enough, sophisticated enough psychologically to make plans. I can make a plan for later in the day. I may plan to prepare a certain meal or watch a certain program on television or do a certain thing. So I'm capable of making aims or formulating ends, and you are too. But no fetus has that capacity, and no newborn does either. That will come later. If the newborn is not killed or allowed to die, then in due course it will develop the capacity to make aims, as they put it, or promote or make plans. Next, neither the fetus nor the newborn can be harmed by being deprived of its life. And we'll take a closer look at that claim in the next section. So be patient on that one. Neither the fetus nor the newborn is self-aware. They don't have the capacity for self-awareness. They may be aware, right? Newborns have awareness. That means they can respond to stimuli in their environment. If you move your hand like this in front of the face of a newborn, that newborn will probably follow your hand with his or her eyes. Okay? But that's called awareness of things in the world outside of it. Self-awareness is much more demanding. Self-awareness requires that you be aware of yourself as a distinct being in the world, distinct from other things. And the authors claim that no fetus and no newborn has that capacity, that which we're calling self-awareness. And finally, neither the fetus nor the newborn has what the authors call well-developed plans. Well-developed plans. And I think that's related to the point they made earlier that neither the fetus nor the newborn is capable of making aims, as they put it. Okay, so let's create a little bit of a timeline. Let's mark off some points in the development of a person. First, there's conception. That's the point at which the egg and sperm fuse to create a genetically unique individual. And then at some later point, birth. That's when the being that has been developing is removed from the woman's body or expelled from the woman's body, either naturally or through an abortion. or a miscarriage. And then there is a point at which that being becomes a person. And the authors are coy in not telling us when that is. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, and we'll look for clues in their essay about when they think personhood begins, at what age. But for the moment, I'm just trying to mark off some points. Conception, birth, and that point, whenever it occurs, where personhood begins. So let's give the name fetus to the being from conception to birth. We'll call that thing, that being, a fetus. Let's call the being from birth until the onset of personhood, let's call that a newborn or an infant. And then once personhood begins, we'll call that being a child, a developing child. And eventually the child will become an adult. So you have children who are persons, and then later they become adults who are persons. But before that magical moment, it's not a person at all. Newborns are not persons in the author's view. So I said a moment ago that I would come back and look at the four possibilities. If you look at my notes near the bottom of page 5, the authors believe that there are human non-persons. Okay, let that sink in. Human beings, in the biological sense, who are not persons and therefore have no right to life. So who would these be and why? They would include in this category embryos, fetuses, and newborns. Now, they also misleadingly add, quote, criminals where capital punishment is legal. And you can see in my notes, I say that's absurd, that criminals who've committed murder and are being punished with death never stop being persons, legally or morally. What we say is that they're persons all through this process, but that they have forfeited their right to life. They retain their personhood, but they've lost a privilege or a right that they once had. And that's because of the actions that they performed, the murders. So that's just, when the authors put that in, that's just sloppy analysis or sloppy writing. Okay? So that's the category of human non-persons. Now, there may be some others at the other end of life. If someone lapses into a coma, for example, like Karen Ann Quinlan, an irreversible coma, that's a human being still. It's biologically the same entity, but personhood has ceased. So Karen Ann Quinlan, once she lapsed into this irreversible coma, she lost her personhood, right? It was the same biological entity, but no longer a person. And you might say the same about people who are senile or who have serious dementia. They were once persons, but because of their disease, they have lost it. They've lost their precious personhood. Okay, but they never stop being humans. Okay, so that's the first of four categories. There are also human persons, and that simply means there are beings who are both humans in the biological sense and persons in the moral sense. And that would include you, me, and many others. Okay? We're both persons and humans. The authors believe that there are non-human persons. In other words, there are beings who are not human beings, but are persons in the moral sense. And this would include, in the author's view, certain animals, certain non-human animals, such as the great apes, perhaps porpoises, whales, or dolphins, maybe bonobos and other primates. So the authors at least want to leave it open as a possibility that there are non-human persons. And they don't mention this, but many people say that for all we know, there are intelligent life forms outside of our Earth, right? Extraterrestrial intelligence. And if that's true, if we ever encounter these intelligent, sensitive beings, we may consider them to be persons because they may possess all of the requirements for personhood, self-awareness, rationality, and so forth. So that would be another example of a non-human person. Okay? It's hypothetical. I'm not saying there are such beings, but there could be. And maybe one day we will encounter some, and we will treat them as persons, the same way we treat ourselves as persons. And we may say even that they have a right to life. And finally, there are non-human, non-persons. There are things in the world, many of them, that are neither human beings biologically nor moral persons. For example, I'm going to hold up my mouse, my computer mouse, right? That's a non-human, non-person. So this category is very large in terms of its membership. It contains inanimate objects. It contains all the plants of the world, every individual plant, and so on. So lots of things fall into this category. Now let's go back to the doctrine of the sanctity of life. Many people who hold that view disagree with Giubilini and Minerva about these categories. Many people who subscribe to the doctrine of the sanctity of human life say that all and only human beings are persons. All humans are persons, and only humans are persons. And many of them who say this have a theological basis for it. They say that God created human beings in God's image and endowed them with rationality and self-awareness and all of the other characteristics that make up personhood. So God created humans as persons, and no other beings have that God-given attribute or quality of being a person. So these people would reject two aspects of Giubilini and Minerva's view. Right? The people who hold the doctrine of the sanctity of human life hold the view that no animals are persons and no aliens are persons either. Only humans are persons. And they would also reject the view that humans ever lose their personhood. They hold that fetuses from the moment of conception are human persons with a right to life, and that people who are irreversibly comatose or senile or demented, they are still human persons as well. So those people who hold the doctrine of the sanctity of human life, they say that there are only two categories in the world. Everything in the world is in one of two categories. Either it's a human being and also a person, or it's neither a human nor a person. Okay, two categories. Giubilini and Minerva are trying to explode that and say, wait a minute, there are those two categories, but there are two other ones as well. Non-human persons and non-person humans, if you will. Human non-persons. All right, so Giubilini and Minerva are in some ways radical. Like many philosophers, they are calling into question traditional views of the relationship between humans and persons. They say that there are 4 categories of beings in the world and not just 2. And they hope one day to revise our thinking. They would like it so that everyone acknowledged 4 categories instead of just 2. They believe that people are biased. Human beings tend to be biased, they might say, against other beings being persons, right? We kind of selfishly arrogate the category of personhood to ourselves. We think so highly of ourselves as human beings that we deny personhood to all other beings who are not humans. Okay, turn to page 6. I tried to reconstruct one of their arguments. This is their argument, I think, why fetuses and newborns are not persons. You know now that they do not consider themselves to be persons. Why is that? Well, look at my argument. It has 2 premises and a conclusion. The conclusion is no fetuses or newborns are persons, and therefore they have no moral right to life. How do they arrive at that conclusion? Well, here are the 2 premises. Number 1, they claim, first of all, that only beings who are, quote, capable of attributing to their own existence some at least basic value are persons. So what they're saying there is that in order to be a person, you have to have a certain characteristic. The second premise says no fetus or newborn has that characteristic. And therefore, it follows that no fetus or newborn is a person. It's a pretty simple argument. Think of a club. Think of it as the personhood club. Imagine a clubhouse with a door. And the clubhouse has members. It has membership. And they have rules for what it takes to be a member of that club, the personhood club. One of the rules of the club is that you can't come in and become a member unless you have a certain characteristic. And suppose a fetus or a newborn knocked on the door and said, "Can I join the club?" The members would look over their rules and say, "No, sorry, I can see that you lack the characteristic that is necessary for being a member of this club." So they close the door, and the poor fetuses and newborns have to stay out of the club. Okay, so really the argument is that simple. In order to be a member of this exclusive club called persons, you have to be able to, as they put it, attribute to your own existence some at least basic value. And unfortunately, fetuses and newborns are unable to do that. They lack that capacity. So they're shut out of the club. They cannot be and are not, therefore, persons. So what's the conclusion of the authors, the grand conclusion of their argument? They claim here in this section on page 262, they say the rights and interests of the actual people involved should represent the prevailing consideration in a decision about abortion and afterbirth abortion, unquote. So what are they saying? They're saying if we're correct, the authors are saying this, if we're correct that no fetus and no newborn is a person with a right to life, then the decision of a pregnant woman or a new mother, the decision about whether to kill her fetus or her newborn depends upon her interests and her rights. It may be the rights of other persons, maybe the father or others who have an interest in the child. But the child, the newborn itself, has no rights. And if you have no rights, you have no rights that can be violated. So killing a newborn, they say, at a bare minimum, doesn't violate the rights of the newborn. And I think they would go further than that and say you cannot wrong a newborn, at least if you kill it painlessly. Now, newborns are sentient beings. They admit that. And it's wrong, in their view, to inflict pain without a very good reason. So the authors, I think, would say that a woman's decision to kill her newborn could be wrong if it's not painlessly done. But provided it's a painless killing, it violates no rights that the newborn has. It has no right to life, and there are no other rights, I think they would say, that are being violated. Okay, so a woman who painlessly puts to death her newborn does nothing wrong. Her interests are what matter. Her rights are what matter. Okay, I'm going to go down to the next section. They have a section of their essay entitled "The Fetus and the Newborn Are Potential Persons." Let's see what they say in there. First of all, you know from earlier today that in their view, fetuses and newborns are potential persons. What that means is they have the potential. They have the potential. It's built up. It's built into them, so to speak. Like an acorn. An acorn has the potential to become an oak tree. A fetus and a newborn have the potential to become a person. But a lot is going to have to happen along the way in order for them to become persons, including a decision by the pregnant woman or the new mother not to kill that being. So they admit that the fetus and the newborn are potential persons. The question now becomes, aren't you harming that potential person when you end its life or when you deprive it of the chance to become a person? And the author's view is no. You do not harm a fetus or a newborn by depriving it of the opportunity to become a person. And here's their argument. Now, I reconstructed it. It's at the bottom of page 6. It's a 6-step argument. It has actually 3 conclusions. So think of it as a chain argument. It's an argument where it's a series of 3 arguments that link together like a chain. These would be the links of a chain. So the idea is that in a chain argument like this, the chain argument as a whole is no stronger than its weakest link. So all 3 of these arguments that make up the chain have to be strong in order for the whole chain argument to be strong. And a critic could find fault with just one of the 3 arguments. If you can show that even one of the 3 arguments that make up the chain is a bad argument, then you will have destroyed the whole chain argument. All right? So if you're making a chain argument, the burden is on you to make sure every link in the chain is strong enough to support the weight. Okay, let's begin with the first argument. Look at my handout on page 6. It begins like this. Only beings who can experience harm are beings who can be harmed. Okay, only beings who can experience harm are beings who can be harmed. So what that says is that in order to be harmed, you have to be capable of experiencing that harm. So since a plant can't experience being harmed, it can't be harmed. That would follow from the first premise. Okay, so only beings who can experience harm are beings who can be harmed. It puts experience at the center, doesn't it? Experience of harm is crucial to being harmed. It's a necessary condition for being harmed. Second premise, no fetuses or newborns are beings who can experience harm. And we've seen that earlier. They're not developed enough to experience harm. Right? And therefore, when you put 1 and 2 together, you get the first conclusion. No fetuses or newborns are beings who can be harmed. Why can't they be harmed? Because they can't experience harm, and that's necessary for being harmed. So it's a simple little argument, 2 premises and a conclusion. And notice, I reconstructed this argument so that it's valid. And that means that if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true as well. That doesn't mean the premises are true. A critic might deny the truth of one of those 2 premises. All right, so it's a valid argument, but it may or may not be sound depending on whether its premises are actually true. Okay, let's use 3, which is the conclusion of the first argument, as a premise in a new argument. We'll call it argument number 2. 3 says no fetuses or newborns are beings who can be harmed. A new premise comes in, 4. Only beings who can be harmed are beings who are harmed. Now that may sound like it's repeating itself, but it's not. I'm distinguishing between beings who are actually harmed and beings who can be harmed or who have the capacity to be harmed. So this one says only beings who can be harmed are beings who are actually harmed. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Okay, in order to be harmed, you have to at least have the capacity to be harmed. Now, when you put 3 and 4 together, you get a new conclusion. Conclusion, it's number 5 in the chain, but it's the second conclusion in the chain argument. It says no fetuses or newborns are beings who are harmed. Why are they not harmed? Well, go backward. They're not harmed because they lack the capacity to be harmed. And why do they lack the capacity to be harmed? Because they can't be harmed, right? That was the conclusion of the first argument. No fetuses or newborns are beings who can be harmed. Okay, let's use 5 as a new premise and add let's just go straight from 5 to 6. There's no new premise. 5 says no fetuses or newborns are beings who are harmed. Okay? No fetus or newborn is ever harmed. Therefore, no fetuses or newborns are beings who are harmed by being killed. Okay, so the conclusion 6 is a specification of 5. 5 is more general than 6. So think of it this way. 5 says, here's something you can't do to a fetus or a newborn. Harm it. 6 says, therefore, if you kill it, you don't harm it. No fetus or newborn who is a being who is harmed by being killed. So killing a fetus or a newborn is never to harm it. It can't be harmed because it's not capable of being harmed. Why is it not capable of being harmed? Because it lacks the capacity to experience harm. So that takes us all the way back to the first argument. So the authors have arrived at the conclusion that killing either a fetus or a newborn is not to deprive it of, is not to harm it. It's not to deprive it of anything, right? Because that's what harm is setting back an interest in something. So the authors say the authors say, no, killing a fetus is not to prevent it from becoming a person. All right, so once again, here's the grand conclusion. No fetuses or persons are beings who are harmed by being killed, i.e., by being prevented from becoming a person capable of appreciating her own being alive. So the authors, by using this argument, are trying to show that not only does no fetus or newborn have a right to life, but no fetus or newborn can be harmed. Yes, they're potential persons, but killing a potential person is not to deprive it of any right that it has to become a person. All right? So if you look at the top of page 7, on page 263 of the author's article, they say, quote, the interests of actual people override the interest of merely potential people to become actual ones. So you've got a conflict, a potential conflict here between I'll call her the pregnant woman / new mother. You've got a conflict between her and this fetus / newborn. And the authors claim that her interests predominate or override the interests of the fetus or newborn. It has no right to life because it's not a person, and it can't be harmed by killing it. Killing it may deprive it of the possibility of becoming a person, but that's not a harm. Okay? That's what they showed in the argument at the bottom of page 6. So they now think they've got a clear path towards showing that a woman who wants to kill her newborn may do so. No rights are being violated because it has no rights. And as long as the killing is painless, she does nothing wrong. So if you think of it as a scale, her interests weigh heavily on the scale. There's nothing on the other side of the scale to outweigh it. Okay, so the scale ends up being like this, and she, morally speaking, gets to make the call. Now, some of you may have thought, even before you reach this following section of the article, what about adoption? Granted that the woman would find it a hardship to bear and care for the newborn, the child, that doesn't mean others can't bear the child, can't care for the child. So let's call it adoption. That's the ordinary term for taking a child from his or her birth parents and raising that child as your own. Right? Many people would love to have a healthy baby to raise as their own child. So isn't this a waste? And isn't there something morally suspect about a woman killing her newborn instead of giving it up for adoption? And here the authors may say something that surprises you. On page 263, they state the objection and then their reply to it. Here is the objection. Quote, healthy and potentially happy people should be given up for adoption if the family cannot raise them up. Okay, that's the objection the critic might make, and maybe you thought of that yourself. Here's their reply. You may find this shocking. They say, however weak the interests of actual people can be, they will always trump the alleged interest of potential people to become actual ones, because this latter interest amounts to zero. And that goes back to the scale metaphor. The mother has interest and rights, and they have some weight on the scale. The interest of the newborn has no weight. It has zero interest, zero rights. Again, I'm assuming that the killing would be painless, because the fetus and newborn does have an interest in not experiencing pain. So the scale ends up like this. Even if it's just a slight imbalance like this, even if the mother's reasons are trivial, it's still enough to outweigh the interest of the newborn, which is zero. Now you might say, really? That seems unfair to the newborn to be killed just because the mother finds it inconvenient to raise a child, or would incur a certain amount of hardship. Maybe she'll have to do without certain things that she wants or even needs to provide for the child. The authors also point out that if the woman does not kill her newborn through this process they call after-birth abortion, she may feel psychological distress if she gives that child up for adoption. They say on page 263, they say the mother might suffer psychological distress from giving her child up for adoption. So let's turn, you'll notice I wrote in my notes, read the section aloud. Let's read a little bit of it from page 263 of the original article. They say, I'll just pick up in mid-paragraph. On this perspective, the interests of the actual people involved matter, and among these interests, we also need to consider the interests of the mother who might suffer psychological distress from giving her child up for adoption. Birth mothers are often reported to experience serious psychological problems due to the inability to elaborate their loss and to cope with their grief. And they cite a study from the Medical Journal of Australia to support that claim. It is true that grief and sense of loss may accompany both abortion and after-birth abortion, as well as adoption. But we cannot assume that for the birth mother, the latter is the least traumatic. She gets to make that call. She gets to decide what would be more traumatic for her, killing her newborn or giving her newborn up for adoption. And some women might conclude that it would be worse if they killed their newborn. They would have to live with that, the grief and the loss, plus the sense that they may have done something wrong. Other women might arrive at a different conclusion. They might conclude that killing their newborn would cause less trauma, less distress than giving it up for adoption. So they go on to write, for example, those who grieve a death must accept the irreversibility of the loss, but natural mothers often dream that their child will return to them. This makes it difficult to accept the reality of the loss because they can never be quite sure whether or not it is irreversible. Wow, that's interesting. They seem to be saying, if I understand them correctly, that if a woman kills her newborn, there's at least a sense of closure for her. Eventually, when she gets through the grieving process, she will get some closure, right? She knows that entity is gone forever and will not pop back up at any point. But when a woman gives her child up for adoption, she never gets that closure. For the rest of her life, she may wonder about that child. How is that child faring? Is the child trying to get in contact with her, to meet up with her, to talk to her, to build a relationship with her? And every day she may get up wondering, is today the day I'll get a knock on the door and my child will come be there to talk to me and to see me? And that could be traumatic. The continual thought that that child is out there and may come back into my life. That seems to be what they're saying there. Let's read the final paragraph in this section at the top of page 263, second column. We are not suggesting that these are definitive reasons against adoption as a valid alternative to after-birth abortion. Much depends on circumstances and psychological reactions. What we are suggesting is that if, notice it's an if-then sentence, if interests of actual people should prevail, which is what they have argued, then after-birth abortion should be considered a permissible option for women who would be damaged by giving up their newborns for adoption. So, in reply to the objection that a woman who doesn't want her newborn because it's burdensome for her and her family should give it up for adoption, their reply is no, because that may harm her interest as well, right? It could cause her ongoing psychological distress throughout the rest of her life, wondering about the condition of that child and whether that child will regain contact with her. So I assume that some women would rather get it over with, end the life of the newborn, and then deal with that psychologically. Eventually, you can put that episode in your life behind you without this recurring thought of the child coming back into your life. Okay, I'm going to skip over a few things. Let's get to the conclusion. I have not yet, in our discussion of this article, given the author's argument. I think it's time we do that now. Now, unfortunately, at no point in their article did they say something like this. Here is our argument, premise 1, blah, blah, blah. Premise 2, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, conclusion 3, blah, blah, blah. Now, that's a nice thing to do if you're writing a philosophical article. If nothing else, you let your reader know that what you take your argument to be. If you don't do that, then you're leaving it up to the interpretation of your reader. And often people read an article and they misunderstand what the author's argument is. And it leads to a lot of back and forth and sometimes acrimony. Someone might write an article critical, let's say critical of Giubilini and Minerva, and say, here is my understanding of their argument. And then here is my criticism of that argument. Giubilini, and that might get published. Giubilini and Minerva read it and say, oh my goodness, that wasn't our argument. That author misunderstood our argument. And they might write a reply saying, in effect, so-and-so misstated our argument. Here's our argument. Not that one, but this one. So wouldn't it be nice if philosophers, when they're arguing, lay out their argument step by step, very painstakingly? I've always thought that would be very nice. Some philosophers do that, and I always appreciate it. Some do not. In this essay, they do not. So, what are we to do? We know they're arguing, or at least we think they're arguing. We have a general idea of what they're arguing and what their reasons are, but we still have to state it in a way that we think gets it right. Well, here is my reconstruction of their argument. Okay? It has two premises and a conclusion. So here we go. Premise number 1. A woman's killing of her healthy, potentially happy, but unbearably burdensome fetus is morally permissible. Period. That seems to be the premise, one of the premises of their argument. They are taking it for granted that it's morally permissible to kill a fetus on the grounds that the fetus is existence is unbearably burdensome to the woman. Okay, or that the fetus's birth and development would be unbearably burdensome. Not just burdensome, because some burdens can be borne, but unbearably burdensome. That means it's a burden that cannot be borne or carried. And notice they're talking about healthy, potentially happy fetuses. So they think that this is widely held. Giubilini and Minerva think that this first premise is widely accepted. Maybe you accept it. Just ask yourself, do you agree with that? Do you agree that a woman who kills her healthy, potentially happy, but unbearably burdensome to her and her family fetus is morally permissible, morally acceptable? Not legally, but we're talking about morality. Right? So the authors think that lots of their readers will accept this premise. Now comes the second premise. Here we go. There is no morally relevant difference between the following two things. One, a woman's killing of her healthy, potentially happy, but unbearably burdensome fetus. And two, a woman's killing of her healthy, potentially happy, but unbearably burdensome newborn. So the second premise of their argument makes a comparison between a fetus and a newborn. And what it says is that in these two situations, there's no morally relevant difference. And that was the point of the section of their article entitled, "The Newborn and the Fetus Are Morally Equivalent," right? That whole section of their article was designed to state this premise. Right? Morally speaking, the fetus and the newborn are alike. For all moral purposes, they're alike. Neither one is a person. They're both potential persons. Neither one has a right to life. Neither one is self-aware. And all those things we looked at earlier today. Remember, I had a whole list of similarities between the fetus and the newborn? All of that comes into the second premise right here. Okay? What follows from these two premises? So I'm going to simplify. Abortion is okay morally. Remember, abortion is the killing of a fetus. Abortion is okay morally. There's no relevant difference between a fetus and a newborn. Doesn't it follow that infanticide, the killing of a newborn, is morally okay or morally permissible? That does follow logically. Do you see that? We've got the second premise says these two things are alike for all moral purposes. The first premise says it's okay to do this. The conclusion is then it's okay to do this. So the authors in this article seem to be claiming that if you're one of those people who think abortion is permissible because of the burden that the child would pose to the woman and her family, then you're committed logically to accepting infanticide, or what they call euphemistically after birth abortion. It seems to me that's the main thrust of the article. It's really a kind of a minor point that they're making in this article. It caused a tremendous controversy, but really all they're doing is drawing out the implications of something that many people already accept, which is that abortion, for purposes of avoiding a burden, is okay morally permissible. Now turn the page. I have a couple more pages of notes, but I'm going to cover only a couple of items on it. If you look at page 8, I give what I call another take on the author's argument. It's near the top of page 8 of my lecture notes. Here's an alternative take. And by alternative, I just mean another way to put it. I don't mean it's disagreeing with anything. It's just another way of looking at what the authors are doing. Here we go. The authors, this is me talking, the authors are saying that if you accept premise 2, then to be consistent, you must make the same moral judgment about abortion and what they call after-birth abortion. if the fetus and the newborn are alike in all morally relevant respects, if you accept that, then you've got to treat the case of abortion the same as you treat the case of afterbirth abortion. And that leaves you two options. Either you permit both or you prohibit both. In other words, either both abortion and afterbirth abortion are morally permissible, or both of them are morally impermissible. Now, of those two possibilities, which one do they personally accept? I'm guessing, but I'm pretty sure they believe that abortion is permissible morally, even if the only reason for it is to avoid a burden on the woman. And because they accept that, and because they accept premise 2, they're committing themselves to accepting what they call after-birth abortion. But here's the key. I just explained to you that if you accept premise 2, you have a choice. Either both abortion and after-birth abortion are permissible, which I think is their chosen route, or you could go the other route and say they're both wrong. Right? If a fetus and a newborn are morally equivalent, as they put it, then if killing a newborn is wrong, then killing a fetus is wrong. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because Giubilini and Minerva, perhaps unwittingly, have just given in this article an argument against abortion. They think they're giving an argument in favor of infanticide, which of course they don't like that word. They call it afterbirth abortion. So they think they're giving an argument in favor of afterbirth abortion, but someone else might take this as an argument against abortion. If you believe that the fetus and the newborn are morally equivalent, and if you already believe that infanticide is wrong, then you now have a reason to believe that abortion is wrong. Nifty. The authors don't talk about this, but their article can be read as an argument against abortion just as easily as it can be read as an argument in favor of infanticide. Okay, one more question on page 8, in about the middle of the page. You may have wondered, as we were discussing personhood, when exactly does a being pass from being a newborn to being a child? In other words, when does personhood occur? The authors are very coy in answering that question. And here's all I could discover in their essay. They say on page 262 that personhood does not occur, quote, in the first days or few weeks after birth. So that narrows it down. There's a period after birth of days and even a few weeks when that being, I'll call it a being to avoid begging any questions, there's a period of a few weeks at which that being is not a person. Okay, so it's at least a few weeks after birth before it becomes a person, but it could be longer. They also say on page 263 that personhood occurs when the newborn is neurologically developed. Right? The brain has to develop to a certain amount, a certain degree, in order for the being in question to have the psychological capacities that are essential to personhood. And I don't know, they don't tell us when that occurs. When do you develop neurologically to the point where you're now a person? Right? We don't know, they don't tell us. And they also say on page 262 that personhood occurs when the newborn acquires expectations and self-awareness. Self-awareness. Now, again, that gives us some tantalizing clues, but hardly anything definitive. I mean, are the authors suggesting, for example, that personhood doesn't occur until the age of 5? I mean, do you have to reach kindergarten to become a person? Is it permissible for a woman to kill her child up until the age of 5 because it's not yet a person? I mean, other philosophers have suggested 5 is about the right age for personhood to begin. Now, my wife and I have a grandchild, Tamlin, who is 2 years and a couple of months old. She turned 2 recently. And we spend a lot of time with her. Is she a person? Has she acquired expectations and self-awareness? I'm pretty sure she's acquired self-awareness by now. And she knows her name. And when you show her a video of herself or a picture, even if it was taken days or weeks ago, she recognizes herself. Tamlin, she might say. So she has self-awareness at the age of 2. And if self-awareness is a requirement for personhood, she at least has satisfied that requirement. But there may be other requirements for personhood that she hasn't yet satisfied, in which case she's not yet a person, in which case, according to the authors, she could be killed by her mother because of the burden of continued provision for her and taking care of her. So one way to criticize an argument is to show that it has unacceptable consequences. Arguably, notice that word, it could, arguably means it could be argued that. Arguably, the author's argument has absurd consequences. And I'm suggesting that it implies, or has as a consequence, that it's morally permissible to kill children up until the age of 2 or perhaps 5. And very few people, I think, are willing to swallow that. And if you're not willing to swallow that, then you have to reject their argument. Something must be wrong with their argument, right? If it has a consequence, a logical consequence that's unacceptable, then you have to reject at least one of their premises. And that might mean opposing abortion, okay? Because the first premise of their argument says abortion is permissible. So if the conclusion says that killing a newborn of up to 2 years of age is morally permissible, and you reject that, you've got to either reject the second premise, which equates fetuses and newborns, or you could reject the first premise and say, I thought abortion was permissible, but now I'm going to change my mind and I'm going to start believing that abortion is wrong, that it's morally impermissible. And I've arrived at that conclusion because of my belief that it's wrong to kill 2-year-old children because they're burdensome. 2-year-old healthy children who have the capacity for happiness. Right? Their argument implies that it's morally permissible to kill such children. Maybe that's why they didn't tell us when a child becomes a person. That would have been really shocking to the audience. You think this essay was provocative and shocking as it is? What if they had said, we think that personhood begins at the age of 2 at the earliest. Therefore, given our argument, it's morally permissible for a woman to kill a healthy 2-year-old child because that child's continued existence would be a financial burden for her and her family, or for society as a whole. I think many people would have said, okay, that is horrific. Now, I'm not suggesting that would justify death threats or anything like that, not at all. I'm just saying it would shock many people, and they would say, I have to reject one of their premises because I cannot accept that conclusion. And that might lead them to reject abortion and to start believing that abortion is wrong as well. Okay, now one more comment and we'll be done, or 2 more comments. The authors wrote a follow-up essay that was published in the same issue of the journal in which this one appeared. Remember, the original article entitled After Birth Abortion was published online originally, not in a print journal. And that's what caused all the controversy. Over a year later, when the print edition came out, the editor allowed not only republished the online version, but allowed them to write a short follow-up essay. And in the meantime, they had written a blog post. 8 days after this appeared online, they wrote a blog post. All of those items are posted on Canvas for you to read. Now, let's read a little bit from the follow-up essay, the one entitled Clarifications. I've got it stapled to the original one. Clarifications on the moral status of newborns. Okay, I'm going to read from my notes. You can follow along on page 9 at the top. Here's what they say in their follow-up article with all of the controversy behind them. Our article suggests that the same circumstances that justify terminating the life of fetuses without disabilities, an option about which there is broad consensus, also would justify terminating the life of newborns without disabilities, unquote. So that's their attempt to distill the essence of their first article and restate it, to clarify it. Remember, they're trying to clarify in this short article what they should have clarified in the original article. So they think their argument is, lots of people believe that abortion is permissible of a healthy fetus when it would be its birth and provision would be a burden on the mother. But there's no morally relevant difference between a fetus and a newborn. Therefore, those same people who accept the permissibility of abortion are committed, logically, to accepting the permissibility of afterbirth abortion, or what most of us would call infanticide. So that's their attempt to state their argument. And I used that when I reconstructed their argument on page 7. I go back to page 7. We went over that a few minutes ago. I used that. That gave me some clues about what they think their argument is, or how they understand their argument. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about for the whole semester is on page 9. The editor of the journal, which originally published their article online and later published it in print with a clarification, and also allowed them to publish an open letter on the blog of the journal. The editor is Julian Savulescu, and I believe he's still the editor of that journal. He got death threats just as the authors did, because the editor has a lot of choice in the matter of which articles to publish. So he allowed it to be published when he could have refused, and he therefore bears some responsibility for it appearing in print. Again, I'm not saying any of the abuse he received is justified. I'm just saying he's responsible for his actions. And he must have felt compelled to justify his actions, because he wrote this in the journal. He said, as editor of the journal, I would like to defend its publication. The arguments presented, in fact, are largely not new and have been presented repeatedly in the academic literature and public fora by the most eminent philosophers and bioethicists in the world, including Peter Singer, Michael Tooley, and John Harris, in defense of infanticide, which the authors call afterbirth abortion. Okay, that's his first paragraph. Notice what he's saying. Largely, there's really not much new in this article by Giubilini and Minerva. The arguments are largely not new. They've already been out there in the literature for decades. The novel contribution of this paper is not an argument in favor of infanticide. The paper repeats the arguments made famous by Tooley and Singer, but rather their application in consideration of maternal and family interests. The paper also draws attention to the fact that infanticide is practiced in the Netherlands. That's the Groningen Protocol, and that's why I asked you to read it. Okay? So what is Savulescu saying? He's saying largely the arguments in favor of infanticide have been out there for decades, and they didn't cause a ruckus. Maybe because the general public didn't know about them. Only philosophers had seen those arguments. What's new about Giubilini and Minerva's article is that they're extending the arguments for infanticide to economic reasons. Because Singer and Tooley and Harris, when they defended infanticide, they were talking about deformed or defective or severely ill newborns. Their focus was limited to that class of infants. And what they argued is that because these infants are defective and because the quality of their life will be poor, they may be killed by their parents. What Giubilini and Minerva are doing is saying, wait a minute, we allow abortion not just of defective fetuses or those that can be expected to have poor lives. We allow abortion for financial considerations where the fetus's existence would be a burden to the mother if she were to take it to term. Well, doesn't that show that she may kill a newborn for those same financial considerations because of its burdensomeness? After all, a fetus and a newborn are relevantly similar. There's no morally relevant difference between them. So if it's okay to abort for financial reasons, it's okay to kill a newborn for financial reasons. So Savulescu is stating in a very tantalizing way, what's new about this article is the extension of the argument that's been out there to financial reasons. And I think that's going to make a lot of people balk. People who might have been persuaded by Singer and Tooley into thinking that it's permissible for a mother to kill a defective newborn for its own good. Really, that's euthanasia. Tooley and Singer and Harris were arguing for euthanasia of newborns. Remember, that means for its own good. Giubilini and Minerva are arguing for the killing of infants not for their own good. They're healthy and they're potentially happy. They could have good lives. They're arguing that newborns may be killed for financial reasons. That's not euthanasia. Right? It's not in the best interest of the newborn to be killed. So I hope you understood the argument of this article. Again, it's poorly written. I'm thinking of writing an article about this article. I've been thinking about it for several years. In fact, I've already started it. I have about half of it written, but I think I may start over. I'll use some of what I've already written, but I think I'm on a fresh start. And I'm going to focus on different aspects of the essay. One of the things I'm going to talk about is the fact that because it's sloppily written, people misunderstood and they assumed the worst. Many people thought that Giubilini and Minerva were arguing that the law should be changed to allow women to kill their babies. And they protest that they had nothing to say about the law. If you read their open letter, they must have gotten a lot of people said, how dare you advocate that the law change to make it not a crime to kill your baby. And Giubilini and Minerva said, oh my goodness, we never meant for this to be an argument that the law should be changed. The law prohibits killing of children, obviously. And they're saying, we never made any claim about what the law should be at all. We're making a moral argument. One of the things I want to talk about in my paper is their language was so sloppy that they led people to believe that they were advocating changes in the law. They said, should be permitted. Instead of saying morally permissible, they said, should be permitted. Well, that sounds like the legal authorities should permit it. In other words, the law should allow it. So their sloppiness generated much of the controversy. I want to talk about that in my paper. And I'm also going to reconstruct their argument and talk about the fact that someone could take it as an argument against abortion instead of an argument in favor of infanticide. So there are 3 or 4 things I'll pack in to my article. We'll see how it goes. But now that the semester's over, I have a little bit more time, and I think that may well be my next project. All right, I've enjoyed this semester. Every time I teach this course, I learn so much more. It's amazing. I could teach this for another 50 years, and I assure you, even if I used the same articles, which I sometimes do, I would see and learn new things from them. So I hope you've enjoyed the course. I hope you've learned a lot. I hope your reasoning and analytical skills have been improved by this course. That's always one of my main goals as a philosopher. And remember, the only other requirement for you is that you take the exam 1 week from today, sometime between 8 in the morning and 8 in the evening. And I will go in at some point after the deadline is ended, and I will write down everyone's score. I will then add it to my list, which has your other 2 scores. I will calculate your final score by adding your 3 scores and dividing by 3. And then I will assign grades based on the 10% scale. It's all explained on the syllabus. And then I will go in to MyMav and I will post the grades. And I will do so by my deadline. I will meet my deadline. After that, you're on your own. I don't know what happens after that. The university has my grades that I've posted, and it will get them to you in whatever way it does that. And you must know, you've had other courses, you've gotten other grades, you must know how you get them. So please don't write to me and say, can you tell me my grade? It's just, I'm going to get a bunch of emails. It's tedious to write back. You'll get your grade from the university in due course. So just be patient. Okay, again, I've enjoyed the semester. I hope you did too. And this is the last time I'll see you on video. If you're interested in further courses from me, I can tell you that in the fall, I'll be teaching logic and philosophy of religion. Both courses will be capped at 30. And so if you really want to take either one of them, make sure you sign up early before they get full. Okay, take care and have a nice summer.